Beneath the scarred earth of World War I lies a trench no map dares to name, a place where soldiers vanished without a trace, where the walls themselves seemed to breathe, and the ground whispered their names. They called it Sector 13, the Cursed Trench. This is not just a war story. It is the tale of why no one digs there anymore. The orders came down on a cold, grey afternoon when the sky hung low, sagging with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered it. The men of Captain Edward Hale's company had been rotated off the front line for a single night of rest when the dispatch rider arrived. The respite had lasted just long enough for cigarettes to burn to their nubs and for tin mugs of weak tea to be passed around before the word spread. They were to take position in a trench section that every man on the front whispered about, though never loudly. It had no official name. On the maps it was marked as Sector 13, though most of the Tommies spat over their shoulders when they heard it. To the French soldiers, it was known as La Boue Maudite, the cursed mud. The Germans had their own name, Die Grabung, the digging ground. Whatever the tongue, the meaning was the same. No one wanted to be sent there. Sergeant Briggs muttered as he shouldered his rifle, the lines in his weathered face deepening. Bloody hell, Captain. Of all the mudholes in France, they send us there. Captain Hale adjusted his spectacles, which always seemed to slide down his nose at the worst times. His education had been in dusty libraries and lecture halls, not in blood and trenches, but the war had demanded professors become officers and scholars become soldiers. Orders are orders, Briggs. We'll hold the line there as anywhere else. Don't tell me you believe the stories. Briggs spat into the dirt. Don't that need to believe, sir. Just need to know too many blokes went in and didn't set come out. Private Samuel Carter, barely 19, clutched his rifle with white knuckles. He'd been in France less than 2 months, still smelling faintly of home soil and hay. What stories, Sarge? He asked, his voice low, as though afraid the air itself might be listening. Briggs glanced at him, then at the other men within earshot. He kept his tone level, but the words carried weight. Patrols gone missing, digging sounds at night when no one sips digging, men swearing the walls of the trench moved, like they was breathing, and screams. Always the screams. The young private shivered despite his heavy coat. Hale shook his head sharply, as if to cut off the conversation. Enough. Superstition is the rot that kills morale faster than enemy fire. We still take position, and you still see it. This is nothing more than tired men frightening themselves. But when they marched into the sector that evening, even Captain Hale could not quite shake the sense that the air changed. The trench walls loomed higher here, darker, as if the soil had been dug deeper and left to sweat moisture from its sides. Mud clung greedily to their boots, sucking with each step, as if the ground resented their intrusion. Rats skittered ahead of them, disappearing into cracks that seemed too small for their bodies. The silence was the worst of it. Even at the front, there was usually the distant percussion of artillery, the occasional rattle of machine guns, or shouted orders carried on the wind. Here sound seemed swallowed. Voices died quickly, and even the scrape of boots on duckboards was muffled, like the trench itself wished to hush them. Carter glanced at the others. "Feels wrong here, sir," he whispered. "Keep your wits, lad," Briggs said, though his hand hovered near the charm on a chain he kept tucked under his uniform. A Catholic medal, worn smooth from years of rubbing between calloused fingers. Captain Hale forced himself to sound steady. "It's just another line, nothing more." Yet even as he said it, his scholarly mind noted the way the trench twisted unnaturally, the angles slightly off, as though it hadn't been dug by men with shovels but by something burrowing deeper. They reached their assigned post just as dusk settled. The men set about reinforcing firing steps and checking rifles, though all worked in uneasy silence. Carter found himself glancing over his shoulder at the trench wall, half convinced he'd seen it twitch like muscle beneath skin. That night, before the lamps were doused, Sergeant Briggs leaned closer to Hale. His voice was low, grim. "Mark my words, Captain. This place ain't set right. Men say the ground remembers, that all the dead buried in it, French, German, Brit, none of thin, rest easy." Hale met his gaze but didn't answer. For once, Reason had no retort. Above them the sky darkened into a starless black, and from somewhere deep in the trench line ahead, faint but undeniable, came the sound of digging. By dawn the men of Captain Hale's company had settled uneasily into the cursed trench. Morning light brought no comfort. Instead it revealed the true weight of the place. The walls of mud glistened with a dampness that never dried, and the duckboards sagged under layers of slime. Every step seemed to sink them deeper into a mire that wanted to pull them under. Private Carter tried to keep busy. He scrubbed his bayonet with an oily rag, though the blade was already spotless. Anything to keep his hands moving, to keep his eyes away from the trench wall that bulged and sagged as if swollen with something beneath. "Feels warmer here," he said softly. Sergeant Briggs grunted, leaning against a sandbag parapet with his rifle propped nearby. "That sip's sick cause the ground sips rotten, like a compost heap. Things die in it, they keep rotten sips, never stops." Captain Hale overheard, but refused to indulge the sergeant's sets, grim musings. "Soil decomposition produces heat," he said, his tone clipped, as if delivering a lecture, perfectly natural. "Then why does it stink like a charnel pit?" Briggs muttered. Hale ignored him, but he couldn't ignore the smell. It wasn't the usual stench of stagnant water and unwashed bodies, nor even the rank odor of dead rats. This was sharper, heavier, as though every shovelful of earth contained a whisper of decay. He caught himself breathing shallowly, unwilling to take too much of it in. The men were restless. Rumors about Sector 13 had preceded them, and now those rumors were filling the silences. A few soldiers swore they'd heard knocking in the night. Another claimed he'd seen handprints pressed into the mud wall, fingers splayed wide, too fresh to belong to the long dead. Carter stayed quiet, but he hadn't slept. He'd lain awake staring at the trench ceiling, certain he could feel the earth pressing down, a suffocating weight above him. More than once he thought he'd heard scratching beneath the duckboards. By midday the damp had seeped into everything, clothes, rifles, even their food tins. Hale ordered a work detail to start digging a sump pit to drain excess water. The soldiers groaned, but discipline forced them to comply. It was during that digging that the first true unease took root. Private Lyle, a stout man with a temper, sank his shovel into the mud and struck something solid. Expecting a rock, he dug around it, only to pull free what looked like a rib bone, caked in black soil. The men froze. He laughed nervously, trying to wave it off. "Must be a horse, eh? From the cavalry days." But when more shovels turned up bones, skulls, femurs, shattered pieces of jaw, there was no mistaking them for animal remains. The bones were human, and old. Some carried rusted buttons still clinging to rotted scraps of uniform. The soldiers muttered uneasily, crossing themselves, spitting for luck, clutching charms. Hale knelt to examine one of the skulls. His scholar's mind wanted to catalogue, to analyze. The teeth were worn down, the bone brittle. Not all of them matched the recent war dead. Some seemed older, as though graves long forgotten had been unearthed by the endless shelling. Briggs growled, his voice low. "We stand and sit on a cemetery, sir. Not just ours, not just theirs. This whole bloody place is a grave." Hale forced his voice steady. "This entire front is a grave, Sergeant. Every battlefield is. We honor the dead by pressing on." But Carter couldn't shake the image. He kept picturing those bones lying beneath him, piled layer upon layer, soldiers from wars long past, all crushed into the same soil. How many thousands, how many centuries of death had seeped into this mud? When evening came, a mist rolled in low over the trench line. It coiled between the duckboards, curling around ankles like smoke. The men lit no lamps, unwilling to see more than they had to. Carter leaned against the parapet, watching the fog drift. It seemed thicker here, heavier, almost deliberate in how it lingered. He shivered and whispered without meaning to. "Feels like the ground remembers." Briggs, standing beside him, gave a grim nod. "Aye, lad. And the ground don't tist forgive." Hale opened his mouth to object, to cut short such talk, but then the silence broke. From deep within the trench ahead of them, a sound rose, low, drawn out, unmistakable. The groan of shifting earth. As if the trench itself was breathing. Night settled over Sector 13 like a shroud. The sky above was a suffocating black, clouded and starless, as though the heavens themselves refused to look upon that stretch of earth. No flares lit the horizon, no artillery flashes broke the dark. The line had gone eerily still. The men huddled into their coats, whispering less than usual. Most tried to smoke quietly, shielding their matches from view, but even those flames seemed hesitant to burn here. The trench smelled of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present tang of decay wafting from the soil. Captain Hale made his rounds, checking on each sentry. He moved with deliberate calm, his officer's bearing concealing the unease coiling in his gut. If he faltered, the men would falter, and Hale refused to let that happen. He passed Briggs, who nodded silently from his post near the firing step, and continued toward the section where Private Carter stood watch. The boy Sip's face was pale in the darkness, his hands gripping his Lee Enfield tighter than necessary. Hale placed a hand on his shoulder. "Keep your eyes forward, Carter. The enemy won set wait for daybreak." "Yes, sir," Carter whispered, though his eyes darted constantly, not toward no man's land, but toward the trench walls around him. Hale almost pressed him further. But then a sound rose above the usual sigh of wind, faint at first, like the memory of a voice carried from miles away, then sharper, clearer. A cry. A man's scream, thin, stretched with pain, echoed across the barren stretch of battlefield beyond their trench. Carter stiffened. Briggs, hearing it too, swung his head sharply toward the sound. "Out there," he muttered. The men along the line froze, listening. The scream came again, drawn out and desperate, as though someone was being torn apart. It echoed over the mud, bounced off broken wire and blasted earth, but never seemed to have a source. "Could be one of ours wounded in a raid," said Private Lyle, his voice unsteady. "Might be crawling set out there." "No patrols went out," Briggs replied flatly. "Not from our lot. Not from Jerry Sip's either. Too quiet tonight." Hale forced himself to sound decisive. "Could be a trap. Germans luring us over the top." He raised his voice for all to hear. "No one moves without orders. Hold your posts." The men obeyed, but unease rippled down the trench like a sickness. The scream rose again, closer this time, and then it stopped. Silence, heavy and complete. Carter Stetz, knuckles whitened around his rifle. "Beggin' set your pardon, sir, but I swear it didn't set sound out there, not all of it." Hale frowned. "What do you mean?" The boy swallowed hard, his Adam Sip's apple bobbing. "Sounded like it came from inside the trench, in the walls." Briggs crossed himself, muttering something under his breath. Hale shut his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. Logic. He needed logic. The acoustics of trenches distorted sound. Screams could bounce, echo, twist direction. That was all. And yet he too had thought the last cry had come from uncomfortably close. The hours crawled. Men tried to sleep, but few managed more than shallow dozing, always waking at the faintest rustle. Twice more the screams returned, each time shifting, sometimes near, sometimes far. Once Carter swore he saw shadows ripple across the trench wall as the sound passed, as though something beneath the mud had stirred. When the third cry ended, the trench fell silent again, save for the drip of water into the sump pit and the scratch of rats, but the silence carried a new weight. Carter leaned close to Briggs and whispered, "Sergeant, what happens if it ain't set the enemy? What if it sets the ground?" Briggs said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the trench wall, watching it with the wary expression of a man who'd seen too much already. Captain Hale moved on, unwilling to let fear root too deeply, but when he rounded the next bend in the trench, his boots sank deep into the mud. For a moment, it felt as though something gripped his ankle from beneath, tugging, not just mud, not just suction, but fingers. He wrenched himself free with a sharp pull, nearly stumbling. When he looked down, he saw no print, no hand, only the mud closing back over as if nothing had happened. He did not tell the others. Instead, he climbed onto the firing step, staring out into the dead expanse of no man's land. The blackness yawned wide, empty. No flares, no shapes, no sign of life. And then, faint but undeniable, he heard it again. This time not a scream, but the scrape of something moving within the soil itself, crawling beneath their feet. Morning came reluctantly, as though the sun itself was unwilling to rise over Sector 13. The light was pale, an anemic grey that did little to chase away the heaviness of the night. The men were hollow-eyed, their uniforms damp, their nerves stretched thin. Sergeant Briggs led the first work detail, muttering under his breath as he and several privates took shovels to expand the sump pit. Captain Hale supervised, notebook in hand, making sketches of the trench angles, as though cataloguing its oddities might bring sense to the place. The shovels clattered and scraped. Mud was flung aside in wet clumps, splattering their boots. At first it was routine, back-breaking but familiar labor. Then Private Lyle's shovel struck something solid. "Rock," he muttered, kneeling to dig it out with his hands. The others paused, watching. What he pulled free was not a rock. It was a femur, caked in black soil. The men stared. Lyle dropped it as if burned. The bone landed in the mud with a dull thud, unnervingly human in its shape. "Horsebone," one soldier suggested weakly, but a few more thrusts of the shovel proved otherwise. A skull emerged, its eye sockets hollow, its jaw twisted unnaturally, as though frozen mid-scream. Rotted scraps of fabric clung to it, buttons green with corrosion. "Bloody hell," Briggs breathed. "That ain't sit no horse." The digging stopped. Every man stood silent, their breath misting in the cold morning air. Hal crouched beside the skull, forcing himself to examine it. He was a scholar once. Analysis was second nature. "This is old," he said. "Not recent. The bone sits brittle, worn." He brushed away mud, revealing a cracked insignia on what remained of a uniform scrap. "French. Not from this war." The others muttered uneasily. Hale continued, his voice clipped, matter of fact. "Battles have been fought here for centuries. It's such not unusual for older graves to be disturbed by shelling." But then Briggs leaned down and pulled something else free. A helmet, German, spiked, but crushed inward as though something had clamped it around a man's head. Inside it, nestled in the metal's warped interior, was a skull. No body, just the head, compacted unnaturally. Briggs dropped it with a curse. "Does it look like the earth just shifted it? Looks like the bloody ground took it." Carter, standing nearby, went pale. His breath came shallow, his voice trembling. How many are under us, sir?" Hale did not answer. He glanced at the trench walls. The soil bulged here and there, dark and wet, and he imagined whole layers of bodies pressing outward, thousands of bones crushed together, buried beneath mud that was never meant to be disturbed. The men uncovered more bones, some German, some British. One jaw still bore teeth that had been filed flat, unnatural, predatory. That discovery was quickly buried again, no one daring to linger over it. The unease grew into outright dread. Men crossed themselves, spat for luck, clutched tokens of home. Briggs slipped his fingers over the worn medal he carried, lips moving silently. Carter just stood staring, his shovel hanging limp in his hand. Finally Hale ordered the bones reburied. "Cover them. Leave it. We're soldiers, not grave diggers." His voice was firm, though his hands trembled slightly when he closed his notebook. The men complied reluctantly, shoveling soil back over the fragments. But the damage was done. They'd seen what lay beneath, and they could not unsee it. By afternoon the trench felt different. Heavier, the air was close, damp, pressing on lungs. Carter swore the mud at his feet, shifted, as if restless. Briggs barked at him to keep still, but his own eyes kept darting toward the ground. That evening, as the men lit cigarettes in the fading light, the trench gave a deep, resonant groan. The walls trembled, and clods of mud tumbled loose, revealing the pale arc of another bone before the soil closed over again. No shell had struck. No tremor shook the earth. It was as though the ground had sighed, and in the silence that followed, Every man felt the same chilling thought. They had not uncovered the bones. The bones had allowed themselves to be found. Captain Hale had grown tired of whispers. The men jumped at every creak of wood, every scuttle of rat, every shift of mud. Their nerves were fraying, and discipline was hanging by a thread. As an officer, Hale believed it was his duty to cut through fear with reason. So when the rotation for night watch came, he volunteered to take the first shift. The trench was a hollow silence by midnight. The sky above hung heavy with low clouds, blotting out the moon. No flares lit the horizon. Even the guns seemed absent, as though the war itself had recoiled from Sector 13. Hale stood on the firing step, rifle slung at his shoulder, staring across the wasteland of no man's land. The battlefield beyond was a graveyard of wire and blasted stumps. Pools of stagnant water glistened faintly in the gloom, reflecting shapes that weren't there. In the stillness, Hale's breath was loud in his own ears, a steady rhythm he clung to as proof of life. Behind him the trench slumbered uneasily. Men shifted in their dugouts, muttering in sleep, groaning with nightmares. Briggs had warned him not to stand watch alone. Best not to face this place without company, sir. But Hale insisted. If he could keep his mind steady, perhaps he could lead by example. At first, there was nothing unusual. Rats scuttled, wood creaked, water dripped. He catalogued each sound, forcing his mind to file them neatly. Rats, creaking, dripping, all natural, all explainable. But then he noticed the earth. The trench wall beside him seemed to pulse faintly, just once, a ripple, almost imperceptible, like muscle tightening under skin. Hale blinked, rubbed his eyes. Mud sagged and shifted all the time, perfectly normal. Then it came again, a slow swell and contraction, like the draw of breath. Hale froze. His mind rebelled against the image, but his eyes refused to deny it. The wall was breathing. He stepped closer, heart pounding, reaching out with a trembling hand. His fingers hovered just above the surface. He felt warmth radiating from the soil, unnatural warmth, like flesh fevered with sickness. He jerked his hand back. A sound followed, low, resonant, coming not from the air but from beneath. A groan, not wood, not rat. The groan of something vast, shifting in the deep. Hale's skin prickled. He forced himself to look outward again, to no man's land, searching for logic. Perhaps the men had been right. Echoes distorted, sounds twisting. But as he stared, the ground beyond seemed to stir. Ripples coursed through the mud, faint but visible under the starlight, as if something crawled just beneath the surface, moving parallel to the trench. He gripped his rifle tight, every instinct screaming to fire, to make noise, to break the suffocating silence. But what target could he name? Nothing showed itself, nothing but shifting earth. Then came the voices. Faint at first, carried through the soil, a chorus of whispers layered over one another. Words in English, German, French, snatches of orders, cries for help, prayers muttered in the dark. They rose and fell like the tide, never clear, never complete, but always desperate. Hale pressed his palms over his ears. It made no difference. The voices weren't carried by air, they were inside the ground. Inside him. Captain. The words snapped his eyes open. Someone had spoken his name. He spun, expecting Briggs, Carter, one of the men, but the trench was empty. The voices had fallen silent. Only the drip of water remained. He stood trembling, forcing deep breaths, telling himself he had imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, the power of suggestion. He straightened his shoulders, clinging to discipline like a shield. But as the hours dragged, one certainty settled cold into his bones. He was not alone on that watch. Something unseen watched with him, and it was beneath their feet. Private Samuel Carter hadn't slept a wink since they'd uncovered the bones. He lay awake through the damp hours, staring at the trench ceiling, every creak and shuffle amplified by his imagination. By the time his watch came, his nerves were already frayed to threads. The night was darker than any he'd known. The trench lamps were doused, and the clouds smothered the stars. The world was black soil and black sky, with only the occasional rat skittering across duckboards to prove life still existed. Carter gripped his rifle so hard his fingers ached, his breath fogged in the chill, every exhale loud in his own ears. He whispered to himself, fragments of hymns, verses his mother had taught him, but the words gave no comfort here. At first it was silence. Then, Samuel. He froze. His name, clear, soft, spoken just above a whisper. He swung his head, heart hammering, but the trench was empty. Sergeant Briggs was asleep, 2 bays down. Hale was scribbling notes in his dugout. No one else was near. Carter swallowed. Sarge. No reply, only the faint drip of water. He tried to steady himself, but then it came again. Samuel, help me. The voice rose from the very soil beneath his boots. Not above, not beside, beneath. Carter staggered back, nearly slipping on the duckboards. His mind screamed at him to run, but something deeper, some tug of instinct, pulled him forward instead. He knelt, pressing his ear against the cold mud. The soil was warm, and inside it he heard voices, layered, tangled, all whispering at once. Men begging for water, crying for their mothers, cursing in English, German, French, but one cut through them all, sharp as a blade. Samuel, dig. His breath caught. A compulsion seized him, raw, primal. His hands moved before he thought. He dropped his rifle, seized a trenching tool, and drove it into the wall. Mud sprayed, cold and wet, but the soil seemed to part eagerly beneath his blade. Deeper, the voice urged. I stung, waiting. He dug, like a madman. Each scoop of soil sprayed across the duckboards. His fingers bled as he clawed bare-handed into the trench wall. The voices swelled, a chorus of need, urging him on. Behind him, Briggs stirred. Carter. His voice was groggy, suspicious. What in God's name are you doing? Carter ignored him. He was close. He could feel it. Something was just beyond reach, just beneath the surface. A shape, a presence. Samuel, set me free. Briggs was on his feet now, boots squelching in mud. Lad, stop. You still bring the bloody wall down. But Carter didn't stop. He tore into the soil until his nails split. His eyes were wide, fevered, his mouth muttering prayers and apologies all at once. Then his hand broke through into a pocket of air. He felt something inside, cloth, soft and rotten, fingers, a hand, clutching his wrist with icy strength. Carter screamed. Briggs lunged, grabbing him by the shoulders, yanking him back as the trench wall groaned and collapsed inward. Mud poured down, half burying Carter where he knelt. The hand vanished beneath the rush, leaving only black water and dirt. The sergeant dragged him free, cursing. Hale appeared, spectacles askew, demanding to know what had happened. But Briggs only spat into the mud and muttered. The ground was transept to take him. Carter lay on his back, gasping, his eyes fixed on the wall that had nearly swallowed him. His lips trembled. It knew my name. Hale crouched beside him, gripping his shoulder firmly. Exhaustion, Carter. That sips all. The mind plays tricks when it sips deprived of rest. But Briggs wasn't convinced. He stood staring at the freshly collapsed wall, where rivulets of water ran down like veins. For an instant, he swore he saw shapes pressing outward from beneath the surface, faces in the mud, mouths open in silent screams. He blinked, and they were gone. Still, he muttered under his breath, as he led Carter to safety. The lad ain't set wrong, Capsipner. The mud does know us, and it sets hungry. By the third day in Sector 13, the men were unraveling. Exhaustion clung to them heavier than their packs. The trench seemed to shift and sag around them, mud swallowing boots, duckboards rotting underfoot. Each hour stretched longer than the last, filled with silences broken only by the distant scrape of earth or the sudden skitter of unseen things in the dark. It was during one of these silences that Captain Hale received the order. A patrol was to scout the communication trench branching northward, a half-collapsed spur that linked Sector 13 to the adjoining line. Reports claimed German sappers had been heard tunneling nearby. Confirmation was needed. Sergeant Briggs argued, "That trench ain't set safe, sir. Men go down it, they don't come back." Youssef heard the stories same as I have. "Stories don't win wars," Hale replied curtly. "Orders are orders. We shall send 6 men. Keep it tight. In and out." Briggs swore under his breath but complied. The patrol was assembled. 6 privates, rifles fixed with bayonets, packs light. Carter begged to join, perhaps to prove himself after his brush with the soil, but Briggs denied him. "You're staying put, lad. You've already looked death in the face once." The patrol set off just after dusk, disappearing one by one into the narrow side trench. The air there was colder, wetter, and smelled of mold and stagnant water. Hale stood at the junction, listening to their boots fade into distance. The trench swallowed them quickly, until only silence remained. Minutes dragged. No sound of return, no signal, only the soft hiss of fog creeping over the parapets. Then faintly, a shout. Hale stiffened. "Did you hear that?" Briggs nodded grimly, rifle raised. Carter leaned forward, straining his ears. Another shout followed, muffled, distant, but urgent. Then a scream, sharp, cut short, echoing down the side trench before vanishing into silence. "Get him back," Briggs barked, but even as he moved, the trench answered with a sound none of them expected. The ground groaned, deep, resonant, like a cavern collapsing far below. Mud slowed from the walls, spilling into the main trench. The communication spur shuddered. "Back! Back!" Hale shouted, dragging Carter away. Then, without warning, the earth collapsed. The side trench caved in on itself, soil swallowing the passage in a violent rush. The patrol's shouts were buried mid-cry, muffled into nothing as mud filled every space. When the tremor subsided, the spur was gone, sealed entirely, as though it had never existed. The men stood in stunned silence. Briggs cursed and tried to dig, but the soil was too wet, too heavy. Every shovel of dirt slid back in, as if the ground refused to give up what it had claimed. "Stop," Hale ordered, though his own voice trembled. "You still bury yourself as well." Briggs spat, furious. "We can sit, just leave Sem." "They are gone," Hale said quietly. "You know it." Carter, pale and shaking, pointed with a trembling hand. "Sir, look." They followed his gaze. At the edge of the collapsed spur, half buried in mud, rifles jutted upright. Not scattered, not dropped, but standing, jammed barrel first into the soil, like grave markers, 6 of them. No hands had done it. No living man had the time. The rifles quivered faintly, as if the earth itself still gripped them. The soldiers recoiled. One crossed himself. Another whispered a prayer. Carter clung to Briggs, eyes wide with terror. Hale forced himself to step forward, though every instinct screamed at him to turn away. He reached out to one of the rifles, intending to pull it free, to prove it was nothing unnatural, but when his fingers touched the stock, the wood was slick with something thicker than water. Blood, fresh, warm, impossible. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. "Fall in," he croaked. "Back to positions, now." No one argued. The men retreated, leaving the rifles jutting like crooked teeth from the earth. That night, no one spoke of rescue. No one dared mention the names of the 6 men lost. But in the dark, Carter whispered what they all feared to say aloud. "The ground sept's making its own graves now." The night after the patrol vanished, the trench was silent in a way that went beyond absence of sound. It was a silence that pressed against the ears, swallowing every word before it could carry. Even the rats had fled. The men huddled together, rifles close, cigarettes left unlit. No one wanted to risk seeing their own reflection in the flames' glow. Hale paced the line, keeping his shoulders squared, though inside he felt the same gnawing dread that gripped the others. It began with movement in no man's Sipsland. At first, Carter thought it was fog shifting. A ripple, faint, low across the ground. Then shapes began to rise. figures pushing themselves up from the mud, slowly, laboriously, as though dragged back to their feet by invisible hands. "Sir," Carter whispered. His voice cracked. Their sets men out there." Hale snapped his head toward the field. Shapes, indeed, were forming. Dozens of them. Soldiers. Some wore tattered British khaki. Others German field grey, all caked in slime and rot. Helmets hung askew. Rifles clutched in hands more bone than flesh. Briggs swore under his breath. "Christ preserve us." The figures staggered upright, forming ragged lines across the field, and then without warning they moved, charging, screaming, bayonets lowered. The sound tore through the night, the raw battle cries of the long dead. The trench erupted in chaos as Hale's men raised their rifles and fired. Bullets snapped through the air, flashes lighting the dark. But the dead did not fall. Shots ripped through their chests, tore through skulls, punched holes in torsos. Yet the soldiers kept coming. Their bodies jerked with the impact, wounds spraying black, but they did not stop. The living rounds passed through them, leaving only dripping holes. "Keep firing," Hale shouted, though terror cracked his voice. Carter fired blindly, tears streaming down his cheeks. "They sit you're not dying, sir. They don't sit bloody die." The enemy fell upon them, not striking with bayonets, but reenacting. Ghostly rifles stabbed, spectral bullets fired, phantom shells burst in the distance, and yet each swing, each shot, each explosion carried weight. Private Lyle screamed as an invisible bayonet pierced his gut. Blood bloomed across his tunic, though no steel was visible. He collapsed, writhing, eyes wide with betrayal. "There's nothing there, nothing." His words choked off as crimson filled his mouth. Another man dropped, clutching his throat, gurgling, though no enemy touched him. The trench floor ran slick with blood, mingling with mud until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Hale fired again and again, his rational mind shattered by the impossibility before him. "They stir echoes," he shouted, half to Briggs, half to himself. Echoes of battle, replaying. But his words drowned beneath the roar. The dead clashed in the trench, passing through the living men, but leaving wounds as real as steel. A German in shredded Feldgrau bayoneted Briggs in the shoulder. The sergeant roared in pain, swinging his rifle butt through the apparition's skull. The figure shattered like smoke, but Briggs bled freely, the wound deep and ragged. "They ain't set echoes, sir," Briggs spat, clutching his arm. "They set her hungry." Carter dropped to his knees, hands over his ears, sobbing as phantom shells exploded overhead. Mud rained down, though no artillery had fired. "Make it stop. Please, make it stop." And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The shapes faltered, dissolving back into mist. The screams died away. Silence returned, broken only by the labored gasps of the living and the groans of the wounded. The trench was a charnel house. Blood pooled in duckboards. Men writhed with wounds inflicted by no visible foe, and in the stillness that followed, Hale felt it deep in his bones. The dead were not finished. They would rise again. By dawn, Sector 13 was a ruin of blood and silence. The trench stank of iron and wet earth. Men lay groaning on stretchers, wounds bandaged but seeping, eyes staring at nothing. Some still muttered prayers. Others screamed at ghosts only they could see. Captain Hale tried to count the survivors, but the numbers blurred. Too many wounded, too many missing. He scribbled into his notebook, but the words made no sense. Casualties sustained without engagement. Men cut down by unseen forces. He snapped it shut, unable to continue. Sergeant Briggs paced the trench like a caged animal, shoulder bound in bloodied linen, his jaw clenched with every step. "We can hold this place, sir. The men are cracking sets. Look at sets." Hale glanced around. Soldiers huddled in corners, rocking back and forth. One sat muttering his mother's name over and over. Another stared at his rifle as though it had betrayed him. Carter clung to his helmet, whispering under his breath, his lips cracked and pale. Hale tried to summon authority. "We have orders. This line must be held until relief comes." Briggs stopped, eyes burning. Orders. You think the brass knows what sips down here? They send us in blind, and the ground eats us alive. Orders don't sit mean a damn thing when the mud itself is killin' sip your men. Hale wanted to argue, but before he could, shouting broke out further down the line. Two privates had seized each other by the throat, grappling in the muck. One screamed, "You're a German spy," while the other clawed desperately, swearing he was not. Their eyes were wild, unfocused, as though they truly saw an enemy's face where their comrades should have been. Briggs rushed in, tearing them apart with brute force. One of the privates swung wildly at him, shrieking. "He sits giving orders. Can sit you hear him? The major, he said kill anyone who doesn't sit obey." "There is no major here," Briggs roared, slamming the man into the trench wall. The soldier blinked rapidly, confusion breaking through madness. He collapsed sobbing, whispering apologies. The others muttered, their fear spreading like fire. Men swore they'd heard officers barking commands in German. Some claimed to hear bugles. Others said they saw figures walking the trench, shadowy, just out of sight. Carter tugged at Halesip's sleeve, eyes huge. "Sir, I heard you. You told me to go over the top. You said I sit be safe." Hale stared at him, aghast. "I never said that, Carter. I've hardly spoken to you today." But Carter shook his head violently, trembling. "I heard your voice, clear as day. It said, 'Samuel, over you go.'" Sat. He pointed toward No Man's Sep's land, where the fog curled thick. It came from out there. Hale's mouth went dry. He opened his notebook again, hands shaking, auditory hallucinations, group psychosis, heightened by exhaustion and trauma. The words steadied him, but only slightly. The trench was unraveling, discipline frayed like a rotten rope. Men ignored orders, staring into space, muttering to themselves. A few began loading rifles with a mechanical calm that frightened Hale more than panic. Briggs stood beside him, jaw set hard. They sat here nesters, ghosts of officers, long dead. Commanders giving nest orders into the dirt. That's what this place does, sir. It makes you hear what you fear most. "And what do you fear most, Sergeant?" Hale asked quietly. Briggs met his eyes. That the orders are real, that the ground itself is telling us what to do. Before Hale could reply, a shot cracked. One of the privates had fired his rifle into the dark. The echo rolled along the trench, bouncing off the walls. When the smoke cleared, another man slumped forward, blood soaking his chest. His killer dropped the rifle, staring in horror. "He was German," he whispered. "He was, I swear." The dead man's Sip's helmet bore the British insignia. Panic rippled down the trench like wildfire. Men scrambled, shouting, leveling rifles at shadows and at each other. Hale bellowed for order, his voice raw, but the madness drowned him out. Briggs seized him by the arm, dragging him back. "We have to hold soon together, or this place will finish us before the enemy ever lifts a finger." But even as he spoke, the trench groaned again. The earth shifted beneath their boots, and the whispers rose from the soil, louder than ever. The air grew thick that night, heavy as wet wool. Every breath tasted of copper and rot, every lungful a struggle. Lanterns sputtered, their flames guttering low as though starved of oxygen. The men were half mad already, but now they stared at the trench walls with a new terror. The mud bulged outward in slow, obscene pulses, oozing like flesh under pressure. Captain Hale gripped his notebook with white knuckles, scribbling frantic lines. Trench deformation increasing, soil density inconsistent, structure behaving like muscle. He stopped, staring at the words. He couldn't bring himself to finish the comparison. Sergeant Briggs barked at the men to reinforce the walls, but every shovel driven into the earth came up slick with black slime. The sandbags sagged. The duckboards floated on rising water. It was as though the trench itself rejected their efforts, pushing back against every repair. Then came the first collapse. A section of parapet groaned, then surged inward like a tidal wave. Mud poured into the firing step, burying a soldier to his waist before he could scream. He clawed at the duckboards. but the soil swallowed his arms, his chest. His mouth opened in a howl before the mud closed over his face, dragging him under. The men lunged to dig him free, but the trench wall sealed itself, smooth and slick, leaving no trace he had ever been there. "Sweet Christ," Briggs muttered. "It scents Eton sets alive." The panic spread like fire. Men scrambled trying to climb the ladders, but the ladders snapped under their weight, splintering as the trench shook again. The ground above seemed to lean inward, sagging, collapsing into the trench like jaws closing. Carter screamed as the duckboards buckled beneath him. He dropped his rifle, clawing at Briggs. "It's Stitz pulling me! Sarge! It's Stitz pulling me down!" Briggs yanked him up, muscles straining, boots sinking deeper into muck with every pull. For a moment it seemed Carter would vanish into the bubbling soil, but Briggs hauled him free, both of them collapsing in the slime. Carter sobbed uncontrollably, his eyes rolling white. Hale stumbled through the chaos, shouting for order. "Hold together! Dig supports! Stay calm!" But his words meant nothing now. The trench itself was the enemy, and no amount of discipline could rally men against the ground beneath their boots. Another collapse roared down the line. 2 more soldiers were swallowed whole, their rifles clattering uselessly against the mud. A third was pinned waist-deep, screaming until the pressure crushed his chest with a sickening crack. His scream cut off like a snapped wire. The trench walls loomed higher with each collapse, pressing closer, dripping with water and blood. Faces seemed to bulge from the mud, eyes hollow, mouths gaping in silent screams. One man tried to shoot at them, firing round after round into the wall, but the bullets sank without a trace. The whispers rose louder, overlapping, frantic. Hale clutched his head as voices in English and German barked conflicting orders. "Charge! Hold the line! Dig deeper! Down, down, down!" The ground itself commanded them, pulling their minds apart. "Capsist!" Briggs roared, dragging him back to focus. "We can stay in the trench. It'll close us in." Hale stared wildly at him, spectacles askew, mud streaked across his face. "Where then? Where can we go?" Briggs pointed to the far end, where a section of wall had slumped open into a dark void. A sinkhole yawned, wide enough to swallow a horse. "Better to face what 'tis down there than let this mud choke us like dogs." The ground shuddered again, a violent convulsion that knocked men from their feet. More earth collapsed, closing in, sealing pathways. The trench was shrinking, funneling them toward the gaping hole. Carter clutched Hale's sleeve, eyes wild. "Sir, it sits leading us. It wants us down there." The captain's reason screamed to deny it, but as the trench walls inched closer, groaning like a closing throat, he realized the boy was right. They had no choice. With the walls collapsing around them, Captain Hale, Sergeant Briggs, and Private Carter scrambled toward the sinkhole, plunging into the black maw of the earth. Behind them, Sector 13 sealed shut with a sound like a tomb slamming closed. The sinkhole swallowed them like a throat. Hale tumbled first, sliding down a slick chute of mud and stone, his notebook flying from his grasp. He landed hard on his side, pain jolting through his ribs. Moments later, Briggs and Carter crashed down beside him, coughing, spitting soil from their mouths. Above, the trench walls sealed shut with a groan, smothering the faint light of the surface. Darkness consumed them, thick and total. "Lantern!" Briggs barked, fumbling in the black. His flint sparked once, twice, then caught. A small flame flared, trembling in his shaking hands. The light revealed where they had landed. Not in a narrow tunnel, but a cavern. Vast, stretching beyond the reach of their lantern. The air was heavy, damp, filled with the stench of rot so ancient it seemed fossilized. Every breath tasted of grave dust. Carter gagged, covering his nose. "Sir, where are we?" Hale struggled to steady his voice. Some kind of natural chamber, limestone perhaps, exposed by shelling. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. The walls didn't look natural. They bulged, uneven, veined with roots like black sinew. Briggs raised the lantern higher, and the truth emerged from the shadows. Bones. They were everywhere. The cavern floor was littered with them, brittle and broken. Skulls stared up from the mud, jaws agape in eternal screams, ribs protruded like withered branches. Femurs lay stacked in piles, fused with the soil. Carter whimpered, "Dear God, it sets a grave." "Not just a grave," Briggs said hoarsely. He kicked at the soil, revealing layers beneath, bones stacked upon bones, centuries deep. "It sets a pit. They have been burying Setsmen here for longer than this war sit's been fighting Setsmet." Hale crouched, lifting a skull in trembling hands. The bone was pitted, ancient. No helmet, no uniform scraps. He set it down and picked up another, this one with rusted chainmail still clinging to its neck. Another bore a rusted musket ball wedged in the jaw. Different wars, different centuries, all here. His scholar's mind reeled. This place predated the Great War, preceded Napoleon, preceded everything. The lantern flame flickered. Shadows crawled across the cavern walls, stretching unnaturally long. Faces seemed to form in the dark, grinning, weeping, mouths opening silently. Carter clutched Halesip's sleeve, his voice trembling. "Why here, sir? Why all here?" Halefet's lips moved before he realized he was speaking. "Because the ground remembers, and it keeps what it sets given." A sound rose from the depths of the cavern, a low, resonant rumble, neither wholly natural nor human. It was the sound of something vast shifting in its sleep. Bones rattled, tumbling against one another as the floor itself trembled. Briggs swung the lantern toward the noise. For an instant, the light caught something half buried in the far wall. Not stone, not bone, flesh, ancient, blackened, veined like tree roots, pulsing faintly as if alive. "Jesus," Briggs whispered. His voice cracked for the first time. "That sips no wall." The flesh quivered under the light, and from within it something pressed outward, a handprint, skeletal and massive, sliding along the surface as though testing the barrier. The lantern shook in Briggs's grip, shadows jittering like frantic insects. Carter backed away, nearly tripping over a pile of skulls. "It sits alive. It sits alive down here." Hale felt reason collapse within him. Centuries of burial, centuries of blood soaking into this soil. The war above had fed it more than ever before. And now it stirred. The whispers began again, swelling from every corner of the cavern, not muffled now, but clear, as though the dead themselves spoke directly. Orders, prayers, screams, all layered into one suffocating chorus. "Down. Join us. Down. Feed us. Down." The lantern guttered, nearly dying before Briggs shielded it with his hand. His eyes met Halesip's, hard and grim. "Capsips, we sip found the root." And then, from somewhere deeper in the dark, came the sound of something enormous drawing breath. The cavern itself inhaled. The cavern's breath rolled over them like a furnace wind, hot and damp, reeking of earth long sealed. The lantern flame guttered wildly, casting bones into flickering relief, grinning skulls, twisted spines, hands clawing upward from centuries of mud. Captain Hale Thess, reason strained like a rope, at breaking point. He clung to words, to analysis, to anything that would keep his mind from snapping. This is no natural chamber," he whispered. It sips constructed, layered. Each war, each century, its dead are gathered here." Briggs spat into the mud, his hand tightening on his rifle. A charnel pit, a bloody altar. Carter trembled violently, clutching his helmet as though it could protect him. "But why here, sir? Why does it keep everything?" Hale turned slowly, his eyes scanning the walls. Roots hung like black sinews, pulsing faintly, drawing moisture from the bones. Veins feeding into something vast and unseen. He swallowed hard, because something beneath demands it. The words left his lips before he could stop them, and as they did, the whispers surged. The voices of the dead rose from the walls, overlapping in dozens of tongues. Latin, French, German, English. Orders barked, screams of pain, last prayers. But beneath them all, deeper, older, came a single resonance. Not language but command, a hunger that pulled at the marrow of their bones. Feed! The lantern shook in Briggs's grip. He bared his teeth, a man too long hardened to flinch easily. Whatever it is, the warships fattened it. All these boys, Brits, Jerrys, Frenchies, they ain't set a lions set in graves, they set a fodder. Carterstead's voice cracked, almost childlike. Fodder for what? The cavern answered. From the far wall, the blackened flesh pulsed again. The handprint they had seen spread wider, fingers stretching, pressing outward. The surface split like rotten cloth, and for a heartbeat something vast and pale gleamed beneath. A stone. No, something older, harder to name. The wall sealed again, but the pulse continued, steady as a monstrous heartbeat. Hale's breath quickened. His scholarly mind leapt helplessly to fragments of folklore, to half-forgotten myths whispered in lecture halls. Ancient peoples spoke of gods buried beneath the earth. Not gods of the sky, not gods of mercy, but gods of soil and rot. They fed them the dead to keep them sleeping. Briggs stared at him, incredulous. You sen sets. This isn't sets just a grave. It sets a larder. Hale nodded numbly. And the war, the shells, the digging, the blood, it woke it. The whispers crescendoed until the cavern quaked. Bones rattled, clattering like wind chimes. Carter dropped to his knees, hands clamped over his ears, sobbing. It sits in my head. It sits in my head. Briggs hauled him up, roughly. On your feet, lad. You listened to it. You stirred done for. The sergeant's words were nearly drowned by a new sound, the scrape of movement in the dark. From the piles of bones, figures began to stir. Skulls lifted, jaws opening, spines twisted upright, ribs rattling like cages. Half-formed shapes of men, stitched from centuries of remains, lurched toward them. Carter screamed. Hale staggered back, fumbling for his revolver. He fired, the crack deafening in the cavern, but bullets shattered only bone before the shapes reformed, dragging themselves forward. Briggs swung his rifle like a club, smashing through skulls. Each blow splintered fragments, but the pieces crawled back together, reassembling. Can't kill what's already dead, he roared. The whispers boomed, filling the cavern, no longer voices but one single will: join us. Hale felt it pulling at his mind, at his soul, the irresistible weight of centuries. He saw visions flashing behind his eyes, Romans falling in the mud, knights drowned in blood, musketeers vanishing into the earth. Every war feeding the same hunger, every soldier just another offering. Carter clutched his head, shrieking, "It wants us down here forever. It wants us buried." Briggs grabbed Hale by the collar, dragging him toward a narrow fissure at the cavern sip's edge. There, an opening, might lead us out. The captain stumbled after him, mind reeling, the lantern's light bouncing wildly off the writhing walls. Behind them, the bone creatures lurched closer, their jaws clacking, their sockets burning with the glow of something older than death. As they fled, the cavern itself exhaled again, hot, wet, stinking of rot. The air pulsed with hunger, and the ground beneath their boots trembled as though laughing. Hale stumbled, his reason finally breaking. He gasped the truth aloud, voice echoing in the dark. This place was cursed before our war, and now our war has made it stronger. The fissure gaped like a wound in the cavern wall, narrow but wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The lantern flickered as Briggs shoved Hale and Carter toward it, his face hard and pale under the glow. "Go," he barked. "Move your bloody arses." Behind them, the bone things shambled closer, rattling with every step. Skulls clacked like teeth, ribs splintered as they reformed, limbs stitched themselves from fragments scattered across the floor. They moved without haste, without weakness, inexorable as the tide. Carter hesitated, sobbing, "Sarge, come with us." Briggs shoved him again, rough but desperate. "You two are quicker, smaller, us'll hold F in here." Hale shook his head, breath coming ragged. "No, we all go, together." The sergeant's eyes met his, and for the first time Hale saw not defiance but grim acceptance. Briggs had lived his whole life in mud and blood. He had survived more battles than most men could name, and now he knew some fights weren't meant to be won, only delayed. "Captain," Briggs said quietly, so only Hale could hear. "A commander saves what men he can. The rest is sacrifice. Done sipped, make my death for nothing." Before Hale could answer, the first of the bone creatures lurched within striking distance. Its arms were fused femurs, jagged and sharp, its face a patchwork of skull fragments that grinned obscenely. It reached for Carter with a rasping groan. Briggs swung his rifle like a club, shattering the thing's skull into fragments. Bone shards clattered to the ground, only to twitch and begin crawling back together. "Go!" he roared, his voice echoing through the cavern. Carter whimpered but obeyed, scrambling into the fissure. Hale lingered one moment longer, torn between reason and duty, but when Briggs swung again, smashing through another half-formed corpse, his voice carried no doubt. "Get him out, Captain. You stir the only one who stir remember." Hale's throat closed. He gave one sharp nod, then turned and forced himself into the fissure, crawling after Carter. Behind them, Briggs fought. His curses echoed with every swing. "Come on, you bastards. I've killed your kind before. You think mud can scare me?" The bone things surged, dozens now, spilling from piles, rising from the soil itself. They swarmed him, jaws clattering, claws of fused bone raking at his arms and legs. Briggs roared and swung, his blows echoing, each strike splintering bodies that refused to stay broken. Hale glanced back once. He saw Briggs standing in a storm of bones, blood spraying from fresh cuts, his face lit by the failing lantern flame. For a heartbeat, the sergeant looked larger than life, like some ancient warrior holding a line against impossible odds. Then the ground convulsed. The cavern walls shuddered, roots tearing, bones rattling from above. The earth itself seemed to rise and swallow. Briggs staggered, buried to his knees, then his waist. Still he swung, bellowing defiance. "Not today. Not." The mud surged up, silencing him mid-cry. It swallowed his chest, his arms, his face. The lantern dropped, its flame extinguished in black slime. His final roar echoed unnaturally, stretched and distorted, bouncing off the walls long after his body was gone. Then even that faded, leaving only whispers. Hale dragged Carter through the fissure, both of them sobbing, choking on grief and terror. Carter clawed at the stone, gasping, "We can sit, leave him. We can sit." Hale seized him, shaking hard. "He bought us time. Do not waste it." The fissure narrowed, scraping their shoulders raw, as they forced themselves through. Behind them, the cavern rumbled, bones clattered, voices rose. The ground itself seemed to howl in triumph. Carter wept openly, his body racked with sobs. Hale felt his own tears burning but forced himself forward. Briggs was gone. A man who had fought wars longer than Carter had been alive, consumed not by bullet or bayonet, but by the cursed earth itself. Hale whispered into the dark, more prayer than statement. "I still remember you, Sergeant. I still make sure the world remembers." But the whispers followed them through the stone, mocking, hungry. "Join us, join us, join us." The fissure spat them into a tunnel that narrowed and twisted like a gullet. Hale clawed forward on his belly, his fingers slipping on slick stone, Carter scrambling close behind. The whispers pursued them, muffled at first, then swelling again, seeping through the walls as though the stone itself carried them. "Down, stay down, be still in the soil." Carter whimpered, pressing his palms to his ears. But the voices came from inside now, coiled in the marrow of his bones. Hale grit his teeth, forcing himself forward. Each scrape of his elbows, each drag of his knees felt like moving through a grave's embrace. The tunnel rose, the air thinning, dampness giving way to the sharp bite of open wind. Hale caught the first whiff of it, cold, bitter, clean. He clawed faster, desperate, until his hand broke into open air. With a cry, he dragged himself upward, bursting onto the surface. He collapsed in the muck, coughing, gasping, as if surfacing from drowning. Carter scrambled after him, clawing through the soil until he tumbled beside him, choking and sobbing. They lay sprawled in the middle of no man's land. The battlefield stretched around them in ghostly silence. Wire twisted like broken ribs, shell craters filled with black water. The fog hung low, smothering sound, muting the ruined landscape into something more dream than real. Carter rolled onto his back, his chest heaving. His helmet slipped off, clattering onto the mud. He didn't move to retrieve it. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears. "Sarge," he whispered hoarsely. "We left him." Hale closed his eyes, grief tearing through him like shrapnel. He chose it, to buy us this chance. He forced his voice steady, though it cracked. "Don't sit waste it, Carter. Don't sit you dare waste it." They staggered to their feet, legs trembling, every step a struggle. The mud seemed to resist them, sucking at their boots, tugging at their ankles. Hale could not tell if it was simple suction, or if unseen fingers still reached from below. As they stumbled across the scarred earth, the fog thickened, shapes loomed and dissolved, barbed wire that seemed to coil like serpents, shattered trees that stretched like grasping hands. Every crater whispered, every pool reflected faces that weren't theirs. At one point Carter froze, pointing into the mist. "Sir, look." Hale followed his gaze. Out in the fog, a line of figures marched silently, soldiers, dozens of them, shadows trudging endlessly forward. Their uniforms shifted with each step. French, German, British, faces pale, eyes hollow. None looked at the two survivors, none faltered. They marched into the mist and vanished. "Echoes," Hale whispered, though the word felt feeble. Carter shivered violently. "What if we stir echoes now too? Just ghosts walk in sept at the mud." Hale gripped his shoulder, forcing him forward. "We stir alive, keep moving." They pushed on, step by agonizing step, until at last the fog thinned. Through the veil, the outlines of trenches emerged, not the cursed ones they had fled, but a different line, safer, manned. Hale's heart lurched. Salvation. But before they could reach it, the ground trembled once more. A deep groan rolled beneath their feet, and fissures split the mud. From one nearby crater, black water bubbled violently, spraying muck and bone fragments into the air. Carter screamed, clutching Hale. "It's seps following sepsis. It wa'n't sepet. Let us go." The captain dragged him onward, ignoring the roar behind. The fog parted further, and voices, human voices, rose ahead. Shouts in English, shapes moving along the parapets. "Over here," Hale bellowed, his throat raw. He stumbled the last few yards, dragging Carter with him. Hands reached down, pulling them into the trench. Faces blurred by exhaustion and shock leaned over them, fellow Tommies, eyes wide at the state of the two men. "Christ Almighty, what happened to you?" someone asked. Hale collapsed against the trench wall, mud dripping from his uniform, his mind numb. He had no words, only the echo of whispers still slithering in his skull. Beside him, Carter wept quietly, his body trembling uncontrollably. They had escaped, but both knew the truth. A part of them was still down there, in the dark, with Briggs. The ground rumbled once more, faint but undeniable, before settling into silence. For now, weeks later, Captain Edward Hale sat hunched over a battered desk in a field hospital, his uniform torn and mud-stained, his spectacles cracked at the edge. His body bore only shallow wounds, but his eyes carried a hollow distance. A nurse set a cup of tea beside him, but he did not touch it. Instead, he wrote, page after page in his notebook, his pen scratching furiously, as if he feared the words might vanish if he did not capture them fast enough. Sector 13 must never be reoccupied. The pages filled with his account, the bones unearthed, the patrol swallowed, the trench walls collapsing like a living throat, the cavern beneath, with its endless layers of the dead, Briggs's sacrifice, Carter's madness, the whispers that even now tickled at the edge of his thoughts. He wrote of the truth he could not unsee, that the soil itself was cursed, fattened by centuries of war, that every soldier's death fed something deeper, something older, that the Great War had only woken what slumbered beneath. He paused, his pen trembling, then scrawled the words that had haunted him since that night. The ground remembers. Across the ward, Private Carter sat in bed, his eyes glazed, his lips moving soundlessly. The doctors said he would recover, but Hale knew better. The boy's mind was buried, trapped still in the whispers. Sometimes, late at night, Carter called out to Briggs, sobbing that he could still hear him screaming. The army reviewed Hale's report with skepticism. Superstition, they called it. Stress, shell shock, hysteria. But when engineers were ordered to re-dig Sector 13, the earth collapsed again, swallowing men and tools alike. Those few who escaped spoke of screams in the soil. After that, no one volunteered to return. The maps were redrawn. Sector 13 was left blank. The war pressed on elsewhere, as though that cursed scar of land had ceased to exist. Hale closed his notebook for the last time. He knew most would dismiss his account, but he also knew stories had a way of surviving even when truth did not. Soldiers whispered, rumors spread, and soon no one dug there anymore. He removed his spectacles, rubbed his eyes, and stared at his trembling hands. The mud was gone, washed from his skin, but he still felt it clinging, pulling, whispering. He wondered if it ever truly let go. When he finally looked up, the world outside the tent was quiet. Dawn was breaking, the sky pale and fragile. The guns were distant, muffled. For a moment, it almost felt like peace. But Hale knew peace was a lie. The ground beneath his boots was never still. It shifted. It remembered, and someday when men returned with shovels and shells, it would awaken again. He thought of Briggs, of his roar swallowed mid-curse. He thought of Carter, rocking in his cot, eyes fixed on horrors no one else could see. He thought of the endless bones, piled layer upon layer, the faces pressed into mud that sighed and breathed like living flesh. The war would end someday. Nations would sign treaties, soldiers would march home, but some scars would remain, unhealed, unhealable. And somewhere in France, beneath a forgotten stretch of trench, something vast and ancient would keep breathing in the dark. Hale dipped his pen once more, writing the last words he would ever set down about Sector 13. Do not dig here. Do not disturb it. Let the dead rest, if rest is possible, for the earth beneath this place does not forgive. It remembers, and it hungers still. He closed the notebook, slid it across the desk, and whispered into the silence, Be God help the poor bastard who tries to dig there again. The lantern flickered. The ground shivered once, faintly, as if in answer, and then all was still. This was the cursed tale of Sector 13. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, because every night I bring you a new horror story from the shadows of war. Thank you.